Hi, I'm Jono, and if you're new here, I do pencil drawings. I recently did a deep dive into one of my drawings, August, with the techniques that I use, what I'm thinking about when I'm drawing it, and the response was great. And so I ran a poll on my Patreon to find out which artwork you might be most interested in the thinking process behind the drawings. So I've got Encircle up here in front of me, and I'm going to go through the time-lapse with you and just pick apart and let you know my thought process and the techniques that I'm employing as I go along. Also, a huge thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video, but I'll tell you more about them later. The part that I want to dive into with this drawing is the tree, specifically the foliage, so the leaves and the branches, and how the light caught that and the decisions that I made leading into that. With this drawing, the first thing that I did was apply the graphite of the background, which is not something I usually do. I'm not very confident in my tool's ability to pull graphite out. Often the erasers can't pull out as much as I wanted until recently when I started using more mechanical erasers and the Tombow Mono Zero eraser in a specific way, which really helped me to pull a lot of values out. So I was using that thinking with this drawing rather than drawing around every single little leaf and branch. I could actually do the background first and work negatively, pulling the highlights out. The first stage of this drawing was really experimental. I didn't know if this technique was going to work out. I took a risk, a bit of a gamble, so I was only applying graphite in small sections and then trying to pull it back out. I really wasn't completely happy with the way that it was coming out, but I could see that it had the potential to be a quicker way of achieving the look that I was going for. One of the things to be mindful of when erasing is what becomes very important is how you put your graphite down. So if you were to just push the graphite as hard as you can into the page to try and get the darkest and richest background, you will find it very difficult to pull the graphite back out, even with a mechanical eraser or anything. It's going to leave some residue behind. And so I started to mark out the areas I wanted to pull out the most graphite, and I applied graphite very softly, knowing that I needed to be able to lift it back out as close to white as possible. I was experimenting with different ways of using my erasers. I was alternating between the mechanical eraser and the Tombow Mono Zero eraser, trying to see which one lent itself best to the texture that I was going for. It's really difficult with things like this because sometimes it's the accumulation of a ton of texture for the illusion to be complete, but that means that you have to apply it over a large area, and if it doesn't work, you've kind of ruined the paper for a big area. So I really try to experiment as much as possible early on to see what kind of technique I could use to get the texture I was looking for. Another issue that I ran into with just erasing out was that it looked quite flat and I needed the shadows. So I went back in with a 9B pencil to try and create a bit of the shadows, but again, this started to look a little bit stark and too harsh, and I had to try and find a healthy medium. It was fine for me to use a pencil to do the shadows of the branches, but when it came to doing the shadows in the leaves, that's where it fell short a little bit, and I had to try and find a different method. What I'm trying to capture here is that there are larger bodies of leaves that get light on the top, trying to give that texture and let them fall into shadow, hoping that your eye will kind of assume that that texture continues into the shadowed area. I'm going back in with a little makeup sponge to try and get a more effective shadow with this. It's falling around, it's still looking really messy at this stage. I know that I'm not quite getting the textures I'm looking for. I've changed over to a lighter pencil instead of the 9B. I'm using a 2B now, hoping that maybe with a lighter pencil I might be able to more gently create the texture in the leaves. I'm using my embossing tool to try and get a bit of a reference line and to try and emboss some of the leaves. This is going to help me just see where the line is, so when I apply my background and I go over it, I can see this little white embossed line, and that's just a reference mark for myself. So now I'm starting to feel a bit more confident in the technique. I've got my darker tones, my little shadows. You can see those are just spotted everywhere. The rest of the area, the graphite is just lightly applied. This is still 9B graphite, so it's going to be really dark anyway. The application is a lot gentler than in the shadowed areas. I'm using the Tombow Zero eraser here to negatively draw the branches, and then I'm going to create the shadow for these branches with a pencil or something a bit later on. And now it's a tedious process of creating all of this foliage, hoping that it works out. What I realized was that these are little round balls of leaves. So the leaves on the very top will kind of point upwards, and the leaves that are more in the center will be pointing towards the viewer. And so they will actually just be seen as little dots if you take foreshortening into account. So that was one of the things I learned from the previous section of leaves that I did, and applying it here I realized that I really liked how it was coming out. I'm kind of just copy pasting that technique, seeing if it's going to work for me. I'm trying out a different eraser here. This has got a slightly smaller piece of rubber at the end, and hopefully that might give me a nicer effect, but I'm not convinced about it, so I'm going back in with my normal mechanical eraser. I'm constantly using embossing to try and create marks so that I don't lose my reference points. I'm starting to have a lot of fun. As soon as I got some confidence and results started to look a little bit better, it gets really enjoyable to lean into the technique after you've kind of tested it out a bit. And now I'm going to use that smaller eraser. I think I figured something out here, and it's just a little bit easier to use this eraser now to get the detailed leaves. So I'm using the smaller eraser for the top part of the branches, and then I'm going to use the larger mechanical eraser for the middle part of those bubbles that I was talking about. Also using the mechanical eraser for the branches here, just the highlights on the branches, and then I'll use a pencil to create the shadows in those branches. I find it really difficult sometimes to stay focused in times like this, or with drawings like this. Things get so tedious and repetitive. So now I'm doing something a little bit interesting here, which I was quite happy about. I decided to try and soften the highlights a lot more, so I'm working in with my kneadable eraser. This is going to give the effect that light is falling on a larger area, it's more fluffy and it's softer, and it almost makes it feel more detailed, even though each detail is not defined. And this is something that we need to always remember, which is our eyes fill in a lot of detail. If you draw every single little strand, things often look a little bit wiry and less realistic. Or when the details all start to kind of blend together, we take that for an enhanced sense of detail sometimes. And so I try to use that here to see how it might turn out. Just quickly doing the circle outline here. I was really excited to work with a bit of geometry using shapes, in this case just drawing a really clean circle. I love the contrast of a design aspect interacting with the figure. Again, using my embossing tool just to get my references so that I don't drown my marks in all the graphite. Throwing some graphite down onto the paper, I can push quite hard here, it's not too much of a problem. Using makeup sponges to get that really smooth, dark finish for the background. And then just remember to keep your drawings clean, so I was using some compressed air there. Now I'm set up on this side, using the makeup sponge to do the shadowed areas. I'm leaning more into my technique now, I'm feeling a little bit bolder. And then I'm going to go over it with a makeup sponge in a softer way, knowing that I'm going to dig into that with my eraser. And here we go, repeating the process that I learned from before. I'm not 100% sold on this technique, otherwise I probably would have done the whole tree, so I'm still learning actually at this stage. That's why I kind of only did the smaller section at the top. When I start to get a bit anxious or bored or something, I usually jump around quite a bit. I'll change tools up and I'll experiment with different techniques while I'm drawing, seeing if there's a more efficient way of trying to achieve the textures I'm looking for. This area of the tree has a lot of branches, and so that's a lot of hard lines with some hard highlights. So my technique changed here a little bit, using my 9B pencil and a blending stump to try and blend right up as close as possible to those branches. I'm just defining the shape here of these branches. I'm starting to find my flow again. I think once those branches were sorted out, my anxiety went down a little bit and I could start focusing again. It's always interesting when you have to tackle a new texture, or when there's something interacting with a texture that you've become comfortable with, you almost slow down and very cautiously approach it. I'll almost circle the area that I'm wanting to draw, the area that's starting to scare me, until eventually I build up confidence and I dive in. The second part of the tree was actually a lot more detailed than the initial part that I started off with, and I think that was a blessing, because I would have really struggled to draw this part of the tree off the bat. I think having that slightly easier section in the beginning was really helpful. Now I'm going in with my 9B pencil, just filling in the shadows and adding some texture, adding some branches, and it's kind of just bringing to life this section of the tree. I often try to just keep in mind that there are 3 tones to consider, so it's the highlights, the midtones, and the shadows. And so if you know that you're covering all 3 of those things, you generally will have a pretty full looking image. The takeaway from this was that diving into a texture, you might not always know how to do it when you start off, and I think approaching it curiously, you have to be a little bit bold. You have to just dive in and try and do something that you think might work, and then see if it works. So you do small sections at a time, and by the time you get about, I don't know, midway through, you probably have something figured out. In this case, I had something figured out about a quarter way through or about midway through, and what ended up happening is I just applied all those things that I'd learned in the last little bit of the foliage and went back into the section that I started off with and applied that same technique back there, just to try and get a more homogeneous look to the whole tree, to make sure that no areas of the drawing look neglected. So yeah, I hope this dive into figuring out the texture of this tree was helpful. I love drawing trees, but I find them really, really challenging, and I'm pretty excited to just draw a bunch of them until I have something really figured out, and then I'm confident to just try and draw them as often as possible. But I usually wait a couple months between attempting another tree drawing, just because they do take it out of me and I do find them very difficult. But yeah, let me know if you enjoyed this video. Leave a like if you found it interesting or helpful. It helps the channel out in a huge way. Let me know in the comments how you guys tackle drawing trees, if it's something you find easy, if it's also something that you find quite difficult. I think we all struggle with different things. Before I end this video, I just want to give a quick shout out to this video sponsor, Squarespace. I've been working with them for a couple of years now. They've played a huge role in my career, not only in sponsoring this video and helping me maintain this YouTube channel, but more importantly, early on in my career, I was looking for a way to showcase my work and make it easy for clients to find me and get in touch with me. And I didn't have time to figure out HTML and learn how to build a website, so I was looking for a really easy solution. And I found that Squarespace just did that effortlessly. I never had to patch or upgrade anything. I could register a domain with them, set up an online store, and most importantly, I could design a portfolio and show my work the way that I wanted to. Also, every time I got stuck, their amazing support team helped me out instantly. So if you're looking at building a website, give Squarespace a try. And if you decide that you love them, use the software code and get 10% off your first purchase. So there we go. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.